All righty, good evening. So, if you would, turn in your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus 11. And if you thought all the sacrifice stuff was weird, now we really start to get into the stuff that's strange. So, we'd gone over the chapter that was about the ordination of the priest and this whole elaborate 7-step, 7-day ordaining of the priesthood. And then chapter 9 was the installation of the priest and kind of their first worship service and the first offerings in the temple. And then it's not long after that, and then we see two of Aaron's sons offer strange fire before the Lord. And it's worship that God did not ordain. And God judges them immediately by fire, and they're consumed. So last week we was talking about, kind of what it means to approach God in worship. This week, in chapter 11, we're in this section, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Chapter 16 is the Day of Atonement. But in these next several chapters, it's really all about dealing with what's clean and unclean. And the charge that Moses gave last week in chapter 10 to Aaron was that the duty of the priest, one of them, was to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. So how are they going to do that? Well, God's going to give a very detailed list of things that are clean and unclean. And these chapters are going to seem strange. Some of them might seem kind of repulsive. It talks about, bugs that can and cannot be eaten. We're going to get to where it talks about discharges from the body and like a lot of stuff. And we're like, why is all this in here? And it might seem meaningless to us, but hopefully we can see what this meant for the Hebrews, and we can see how this applies to us today. And if you're tempted to think this is kind of too foreign, just keep in mind that like every culture has, not divinely ordained rights like this. But we all have things about food and about what makes something right and what makes something clean and unclean. Every culture has these kind of unspoken rules. And you probably, your gut react, because I was thinking about this too, probably your gut reaction is to think, well, we don't. But then think about what's the 5-second rule? You can drop something on your disgusting floor, and if you pick it up right away, it's completely fine. Wait 30 seconds and it's completely disgusting. Why is that? It's just things that we have, right? And there's all kind of things like that, picking your nose. It may not be a sin, but it's definitely gross, and you don't do that in front of polite company, right? And then sometimes, even within one culture, we'll have different rules amongst ourselves. And so somebody, if you come in my house, nobody takes off their shoes. I don't really want to see your feet. So keeping your shoes on in my house is completely fine. But I have friends who it's completely not fine. And they want you to leave their shoes at the door. So we all have these kind of things about what makes something kind of clean and unclean, what's taboo or not. And really, the question we're going to ask is, why does the creator of the universe care so much about what we put in our stomach? And is there anything about these kind of forbidden foods and things that we can apply to diagnose our hearts today? So if you're there in chapter 11, we'll look at it in a minute, but it's going to, let me just set it up. There's kind of a, what is this chapter talking about? How does it work and why? And the what is, you're going to see kind of 4 categories of things. It's going to talk about things that are holy and things that are common. So this is the status of something. And one thing that's kind of tempting for us is there's things here that are holy and common, clean and unclean. And sometimes there's moral implications with that. Like an unclean thing is a sinful thing, but not always. Okay? And so sometimes we get a little tripped up when we're looking at these things in the Old Testament, and we assume, all these things. So a woman after she gave birth, having children is a wonderful blessing from the Lord. It's a miracle. It's awesome. But she's ritually unclean for a certain amount of time. Was that because having a baby was sinful? No. It's kind of the status or the condition of a person, a place, or a thing. So there's holy and common. Think like you've got fine china in your house. It's set apart for this very specific purpose. And then if you're like my house, there's also like a stack of paper plates there, and those are for anything, okay? Those are the common. And then within those, there's also clean and unclean, which is more like a condition. And so, but again, not necessarily, it can be sinful, but not always. At the end of this chapter, look kind of at the end, chapter 11, verse 44. It gives kind of a summary of how this all shakes out. And verse 44 says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself, therefore, and be holy, because I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. So you shall be holy, because I am holy." Okay? So this idea that holiness is to be cut apart. It's to be utterly unique. It's often unique in its moral purity as well, but just completely separate. God is holy. There's no one like him. And so there's an element of us that we emulate in that. Also, this chapter kind of breaks down into two things. The first half of it, like the first 23 verses, are about what you eat, things that can enter the body. And then the last half of the chapter is what you can touch, things that you're not allowed to touch with your body. Verse 2, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, These are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals on the earth," stuff you can eat. Verse 24, "By these, moreover, you will be made unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses and becomes unclean until the evening," when something would die or various kind of unclean animals and things would cause you to be unclean if you touch them. And so, first it goes through all these different animals and things you can eat, right? If you look at verse 46, there's a little summary there. It's going to list kind of all the things. "This is the law regarding the animal and the bird and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth." Okay? So actually that kind of copies the Genesis 1 account of when God makes things on the earth. There are beasts, there are birds, there are fish, and then there are insects. And so he starts in verse 3 and he lays out this whole system, right? "Whatever has a divided hoof, showing split hooves, and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these things, among which those which chew the cud, or among those which have a divided hoof, the camel, for though it chews the cud, it does not have a divided hoof, it is unclean to you." And then it goes on and talks about these other kind of cases where it's like, all right, well, they've got hooves, but they don't graze, or they do kind of graze, but they don't have hooves. And so you've got this, if it has cloven hooves and it chews the cuds, animals that graze, all right, that's clean. Cattle, sheep, goats, good. Camels, badgers, rabbits, pigs, no good. And then it goes on to verse 9. "These you may eat, whatever's in the water, everything that has fins and scales in the waters in the sea, or in the rivers, that you can eat." All right, cool. Verse 12, "No scales, then it's unclean. It's detestable," it says. Verse 13 talks about birds, and then it goes on and describes all the different kind of birds that you could eat or not eat. And then probably the part you've really been waiting to get to is, Eric, what do I do with insects? So verse 20, "All winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you." And you're like, cool, because, bugs are gross. But verse 21, "Yet you may eat among the winged insects that walk on all fours, which have jointed legs above their feet and which jump on the earth." So if you've been waiting to eat like grasshoppers and locusts, you're in, okay? So good news there. And then the last half of the chapter is all these things you can touch, verse 24. By these, moreover, you will be made unclean, whoever touches their carcasses, and they become an unclean thing to you. It also gives some other animals, moles and mice, lizards, geckos, those are unclean things. Here's something that's interesting, though, and I think it gives you like a little glimpse into the heart of God. There's also like an exception there. Like, many times when we went through some of the sacrifices, there would be like, well, what about the poor? Well, they could offer a couple turtle doves instead if they can't afford a bull. And so even in this law that we think is like so harsh and demanding, there's still, God still cares for his people. So look like verse 36. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern collecting the water shall be clean, though the one who touches their carcass shall be unclean. It's talking about like, okay, well, what if an animal falls in and, like dies and falls in? Well, the way the laws work, like anything a dead animal touches it becomes unclean, but where they live in the Middle East, water is pretty scarce. So if you just say, all right, well, well's off limits for the next 14 days, well, then what does everybody do for water, right? So even in this case, God is making an exception and says, you can remove this animal. You touch the animal, you're still unclean, but the water will be, okay. Okay, so there's the what of it. There's all this stuff. Why? Why is this stuff here? And there are some bad explanations I hear pretty often. Some will say some of these laws are just purely arbitrary. God doesn't really care, and there's no really rhyme or reason to it. It's just the idea that, God has banned some stuff as a test of obedience. And I don't think that's it at all. Probably even worse is some people to say, well, it's not meaningless. Actually, it's super meaningful. And then they build all these elaborate allegories out of it. Well, the reason why you're not allowed to eat pork is because it roots around in the dirt and it's the symbol of sin, and pigs represent sin and perversion, and therefore we avoid that because the believer in God is supposed to avoid sin and perversion. Why do we eat animals that chew on their cud? Well, in the same way that a cow chews its cud, we chew on the scriptures and we meditate on these things. Those are both silly and not helpful. Okay, there are also some partial reasons. Okay, some people will suggest that, well, maybe if you look through some of these animals and things, you'll see that the things that God allows are the healthier options than what he forbids. And so maybe there's kind of a nutritional reason, or maybe a lot of the foods that are forbidden are things that quickly go bad in the Middle East. They didn't have refrigerators and things. Is that possible? Like, maybe. Like, I'm not a nutritionist, so I don't know. The other ones are a hard no. This one is a partial maybe. Okay. Some would say, well, there's some pagan associations with these things. And so the reason why some of these animals and some of these things are forbidden is because these are things that pagan cultures worshipped or used in their worship. Maybe there's something to that, although from what I can read, there's probably nothing used, like especially even where Israel came from Egypt. Like the bull was really used a lot in worship and was sacrificed by other pagan religions, and Israel does it, and it's fine. So I think, let me give you some of what I think are better reasons. All these animals that you're not supposed to eat are often things, it's animals that eat other animals. And even when it gets to birds and things, it's like the laws seem to focus on avoiding scavengers and predators. Why is that? I think all these laws remind us that death is the enemy. Okay? Um, death is kind of the very definition of impurity. It's because our world has been corrupted that there's death at all. It's the exact opposite of the covenant of life. It's the opposite of the garden. Death renders everything unclean because it's the opposite of what God is about. It's what sin produces. So all these laws should remind people that that death is the enemy. Death makes you unclean. This loss of life. So I think that's some of it. Death is the enemy. Some, and I'll take this with a little grain of salt, but God demands perfection. And I think when you look at some of these animals, like the ones that are clean are those that like fit neatly in a class of animals, right? Like the fish you can eat are the fishiest fish. They're the ones that have scales and, right? And then the other stuff that's kind of weird, like don't eat that. I think maybe there's a nod here, and it doesn't explain everything, but this idea that God demands perfection, and so everything that is orderly and neat and fits in its class is a clean thing, and it's normal and decent, and everything that's imperfect and confused or weird is unclean. I think one of the reasons why I'm looking at that here was because I think that applies later places in Leviticus too. Like, why not like combine two different kinds of fabric? Why is it? My favorite one is, why would it be bad to boil a goat in milk? Like, a goat is a clean animal. You can totally eat that guy. Boil it in water all day long. Boil it in milk, unclean. Why? It's like that mixed message, right? Because one, you've killed this thing, but then like its mother's milk is the very definition of life, and so you're mixing two metaphors. You're killing something in the thing that should give it life, and so I think growing different kind of crops together. I think it's meant to say something about the orderliness and how God keeps things in an order, and He's not chaotic. He's not. He does things for a reason. So maybe give that one a nod. And then a big reason for all these things is that symbolically it sets God's people apart. If you think about it, I mean, I don't know, like there are people in this room far more world traveled than me. I've been like nowhere. But on the scant occasions I've been somewhere, one of the most interesting things to me, and I think most people, what they talk about is, I went to Bermuda and we went in this restaurant and this is the national sandwich, and we drank this and ate this, and so like your food is a big part of your culture, right? So you go different places, and what people eat and what they wear is a big part of that culture. And so God has allowed His people a very distinct way to stand out and be different from everyone else, because it's like, man, this is my diet. And then later on, it's going to be like, this is the stuff we wear. So they're holy. They're meant to look different. They're meant to act different in a fundamental way. Of the way we live is the things that we eat. And what this often turns into, and we're guilty of this too, like sometimes the things that set us apart, they're good things, but these things were never meant to be something that Israel took pride in. That it was never meant to be like, man, we don't eat bacon and you guys do. We're pretty awesome. It was always meant to mirror God's holiness. We're set apart, and in the same way that our God is set apart. And it was to be a reminder for that. And sometimes the things that we look at as things that sanctify us are things that can become points of pride too, instead of things that just make us think of being separate for God's purposes. Okay, so more importantly, how does this apply to us today? Eric, I got no plan on eating a grasshopper. As a matter of fact, I think rabbit is pretty decent. So New Testament Christian, what does this mean to me? Well, first off, Jesus declares all foods clean, right? There's Mark 7:19. Thus he declared all foods clean. In that sermon, Jesus is kind of talking about it's not food that defiles us morally. It's it's the things that come out of us that reveal who we are. Peter has this dream, right? You remember that? It's like God lets a sheet down from heaven. There's all these animals in it. And he's like, "Hey, God, I'm pretty holy. I don't eat that stuff." And God was like, "What I call holy, don't you call unclean?" And here's something interesting. That story gets repeated in Acts 3 times. The only other story in Acts that gets repeated 3 times is Paul's testimony. So you got to think this is pretty important. God is saying something about something has shifted in a pretty important way. And the way you show yourself set apart for God, the way you show holiness is no longer about some of these external things. So Paul tells Timothy, everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with gratitude, right? So it's the thing has turned. It's not about this external thing. Let me count the hooves and the cud and where it comes from and what it eats and what state it's in. And now the examination comes. Well, am I grateful for this? And the view turns inward instead of outward. Even when Paul talks about the way we glorify God in Corinthians, look at what he goes to. He goes to like the most basic rhythm of life, the most what you take for granted. He says, whether you eat or you drink or whatever you do those things to the glory of God. All these things that were mundane are now ways that we do them for God's glory. So there's this big shift. And we move from looking so much at the stomach to looking at the heart. And really, it's easier to make a list of no foods than it is to examine our hearts and see what our motives are and what my sinful patterns are. Do I have pride? Is there envy in my life? Do I slander people? A grocery list is a lot easier than that inward heart look. But that's the shift. And it's not that God no longer cares about holiness. Okay? God didn't change. God still cares deeply about holiness. But a different stomach is easy. A different heart is hard. And so that, I think, is how it applies to us today, that we see all these things as gifts from God. We recognize that when it comes to sanctification, it's a much more inward look. And probably the most important thing of all is that it's not these feasts and what we feast on in the Old Testament that makes us clean. It's who we feast on that makes us clean. In the Old Testament, it was, here's what you refrain from. Whereas in the New Testament, it's, here's who you partake of. And so, Jesus says things like, things that have been radically misapplied and misused. But Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. Jesus says that he is true food. He is true drink. He is the one that cleanses sinners. And it's not, that doesn't mean when we have the Lord's table that crackers and cup turns into the literal or the spiritual body and blood of Jesus. That's not at all what he's saying. In the same way, when Jesus says, I'm a door, it doesn't mean he's a plank of wood that turns on hinges. When he says, I'm the light, it doesn't mean he's a physical menorah. Okay? He's speaking of truths about himself. And in the same way that you partake of food and it becomes part of you, we partake of Jesus in a life-giving, meaningful way where he indwells us and he puts his spirit in us and we become his. Okay? So, and really there's even a real practical application of this. I mean, there's a lot of people that kind of count their salvation on the stuff they eat, what they don't eat, what they put into their body, what they do. You know, we've got a whole culture of vitamins and supplements and longevity and exercise routines and how you can live forever. And none of that's bad to eat good food and take care of yourself. But it's not the way that we, when we let those things become gods in our life, they not only don't save, okay, but they often point us in the wrong direction. All these dietary laws isn't because, God wants to give you divine health instructions. Okay, he wants to illustrate something, and on the most basic kind of human rhythm, eating. We do it 3 or 4 times a day, or more for some of us. In that same way that holiness needs to pervade every part of our day. Okay? It's something that we should think about all throughout the day, of how our God is holy, and then therefore we're to be holy. So hopefully that helps with that passage in a way to make that meaningful for us. Anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts? There's a lot of weird stuff in there, I understand. That's why we didn't read all 48 verses today. Mary?
Safe and healthy, because a lot of those things, geckos and stuff, they have that, stuff you can touch and then make you really sick. And
yeah, lizards are gross.
Yeah, but just they didn't necessarily have all the high heat stoves and stuff that we have today, and God was protecting them without them even knowing it.
Yeah, I think that can definitely be part of it, but the reason why I don't think that's a huge part of it is because in the New Testament that all gets overturned, right?
Right.
And nothing much has changed from their time in Canaan. They still don't have fridges, they still don't have high heat ovens.
Right. We're learning more. I think just all the science and stuff that we've learned just kind of proves and shows that God knew what he was talking about, and he was protecting and taking care of his people way before they even realized it. And that's part of it.
I'll throw a wrench in that, because come sundown, it all gets reversed. When you research this, you're dirty until evening.
Well, I think
I'll call that sundown, and afterwards not.
Well,
What turned up in your research over a difference between evening and day, touching or eating certain things?
Well, I mean, some things did last for longer than that. But I mean, all this wasn't because there's something intrinsically evil about a rabbit. It's just this is an unclean thing, and it's just like the priests were considered holy. But if he was just a regular schlub, you're common, and it wasn't because just the regular people were extra sinful and the priests were extra awesome. I mean, we just looked last week, 2 of them get fried because they disobey God. But it's more in the way of a classification, and then therefore, God's people are meant to determine something from that there is a rhythm of life that reminds us that we are constantly under threat of, corrupting ourselves. We constantly must be mindful that we're separate from the world. We're set apart specifically for God because God says. What was you gonna say, Nate?
Do you think too that, you know, there's a, and maybe I'm looking at this wrong, because there's over 600 laws, right? And so, like God knew that they would break them laws. Now that doesn't that didn't make them like say that, well, it's okay, I knew you would break some. Like, no, they're accountable for what they did. But no one is keeping 600 laws, right? And so do you think, like the New Testament tells us that the law was to point us towards Christ and show us that we need something else. So do you think like with what we read today, there's all these different animals, and then as you talked about with the fabric, and there's so many different laws, do you think a part of that is there's so many to show you that, just as you were saying, I require perfection and you're unable to keep it. I give you all even when you don't mean to, you will still be imperfect and you'll break these laws. You need something else. Do you think like there's an element to that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's like, you know, there's all these different laws in the Old Testament, and some of them are moral, you know, like don't tell lies. You know, some of them are civil, you know, this is just the way you conduct a society. And then there's some that are ceremonial, you know, like these, basically. And there are multiple reasons for, not lying is a good thing. Leaving the corners of your field, say, hey, this is the way the government's going to run. Leave the corners of your field. That's what poor people can get. Like all these things are good in some way or another. But in addition to the part that's good and helpful, it should also always be a reminder of, well, that there may be something about this that reflects the character of God. And then also there's something about this that shows me that if I want to earn my way to God, and I'm thinking, you know what, I can do some stuff. And really, these things in theory wouldn't be hard, right? Eat this, don't eat this. But like if you're going to construct a whole system of, all right, I've got a whole bunch of do's and don'ts. And then like for some reason, as soon as you tell me, you know, I can't eat a squirrel, I really want to eat squirrel. So yeah, all these should expose people's sinfulness, right? So.
I have two things. One, I just like when I read stuff like this, it reminds me of like when the people were following Joshua across the Jordan River, I think it was. I just always wonder if like the masses are like, dude, this guy's full of crap. Like God didn't tell you this stuff. Like, what are you talking about? I just wonder like, cause like if you think about it from their perspective, like there's this guy that you're following, and like the stuff he says, like it pretty much happens. Then every now and then he's like, hey guys, God told me, you know.
Yeah, I don't know. So I mean, think
makes
about
me
it.
wonder, like,
They see a mountain that's like thundering and lightning, like Moses walks down from it, his face glows.
yeah.
Just last week, you know, 2 people offered the wrong sacrifice and fire comes from heaven and consumes them. Like on one hand, you would think Israel has all the revelation they need to know that this is all 100% legit. But every time we turn around too, they're also like, well, you know, I don't know.
It just makes me wonder how, like,
and we're the same way, you know. Is God's revelation completely sufficient to tell us everything that we have to know? Absolutely.
yeah.
And then sometimes we're like, well, you know, I don't know.
You made this one up. This one's from God. Like, but you know, like when Joshua was like telling these people, like, hey, like you guys are gonna get circumcised, and we're gonna do this and that. I just wonder how.
That would make me question one. I mean, I feel like
Yeah,
that's a
have
solid.
some good faith.
It's
to
a
just be
solid
like,
question.
Yep, all right. If God said it, you know, here I go. Yeah.
Here, wait. Let's let our pastor help us.
I just think like what you're saying, Noah, is just a good example. Is just because you have a congregant of people doesn't mean everybody believes
Yeah, there's no way.
the same thing. You think of when Joshua with the I can't think of the family right now, but he steals the gold after Jericho and hides and everything.
Yeah, Achan.
Everybody else is obediently following Christ. They at least demonstrate a belief of faith, but he's like, nah, I think I know something better. And so like sometimes we get tempted, we just lump all of Israel into a belief in Jehovah, but not everybody believed. And that's
Yeah.
clearly demonstrated in their actions.
Yeah,
They
not
believe
all
the
of
stuff
Israel.
They like, but then when it came to something, it's like, I don't want to do
Yeah,
that.
well,
Like
not
that.
all of Israel is, faithful Israel, and we see that, over and over again.
Even Moses they rebelled against him, right? I mean, Korah,
Yeah.
his own family did.
Yeah,
Got wrecked for it.
if they got wrecked for it, yeah, and or even times where it really flips the other way. At one point Elijah is convinced that like there's nobody in the land except for me, Lord, I'm the last holdout. God's like, well, not yet. There are thousands left. That still won't bow the knee. So.
Before Joshua said anything about being circumcised, everybody saw him walk down to the Jordan and the water stopped.
That,
So there was some reason to believe what he
Yeah.
said was true.
yeah. It just makes me, like, situations like that, it just makes me wonder, like, if you were there, like, how that would have played out, like, what that would have looked like, you know what I mean? It's just curiosity, but, and the second thing I was gonna say was just going off of what Nate said. You think, like, stuff like this would have really exposed, like, the Pharisees and stuff who denied Jesus and said, no, we don't need saving, we're the chosen people of Abraham, we don't have any sin, it's like, dude, there's no way you're keeping all this stuff, like, that's just, you'd have to be an idiot
Yeah.
to think that you're keeping all
Yeah.
this.
It's even kind of crazy to think that you did. To really feel like, when the Pharisee and the publican, they both pray, and the one guy's sitting there praying like, Lord, I'm killing it. I'm tithing out of my spices. I am keeping the law. The rich young ruler comes and says the same thing. Man, the law, I've kept it from my youth. But who's, and that guy walks away, without, finding out anything about eternal life. The Pharisee and the publicans, it's the publican that says, Lord, be merciful to me, the sinner.
And you think God would much prefer that than someone who
He
actually
does.
is
He
keeping
ab-
all
he
these laws
absolutely
and
does.
stuff, like,
God prefers those that come to him and admit their unrighteousness than those that come to him and boast of their self-righteousness.
yeah. Okay, I don't need you.
All right, we are out of time. So next week, there's like so many things that we're gonna lump a couple chapters together there, because it gets weirder next week. So we'll do 12 and 13 together for sure, maybe 14 too. What can we pray about?